Thank you so much to the museum for having invited me and for all of you to be here. I got a chance to meet some of you in the lobby, and it was really quite wonderful. And I'm really very pleased to be here in Springfield and pleased to be speaking in front of this kind of amazing background, which is, I think I've never done anything like that before. So let me begin. Israel Abrams, a distinguished British scholar of the late 19th, early 20th century at Cambridge University, like many Jewish historians and intellectuals of his time, saw in the study of history a way to defend the Jews against scurrilous attacks. In his book of 1896, Jewish Life in the Middle Ages, in a chapter called Trades and Occupations, he directly challenged the French writer Anatole Leroy-Boulot, who the previous year, in 1895, had written the following: Jews shun arduous physical undertakings because they are averse to dangerous occupations. Abrams sought to disprove assertions of cowardice in the face of danger on the part of Jews. And how did he do that? He wrote, "The Jewish peddler of recent centuries was no coward. Had he lacked courage, he must have remained at home." So this talk is about those who didn't remain at home. Okay, those who in fact constituted 1/3 of world Jewry, who in the years from the from the end of the 18th century through the 1920s, picked up and moved across some national boundary, starting new lives for themselves and their families in new worlds. Of that 1/3 of world Jewry, particularly of European Jewry, that decided to migrate, 85 to 90% came to the United States. So you can see that this is really a very singular place. But my talk is going to look at Jewish peddling on a much more global scale. Abrams' words offer us a way to think about Jewish migration in that great century and the connection between Jewish migration and peddling. Going out on the road, laden with a jumble of goods, selling door to door, knocking on someone's door, speaking to a housewife in a language that the peddler, the Jewish immigrant peddler, barely knew, and saying in whatever language, "Good morning, ma'am, would you like to look into my bag?" served as a profound, binding, and nearly universal Jewish experience in this great age of migration. Not that all Jews peddled, but so many did, and they did so in every place in the New World to which the Jews migrated, that we could say peddling helped create and shape all new Jewish communities. After the end of the 18th century, peddling provided a powerful vehicle which fostered Jewish migrations out of familiar but economically declining regions to new lands wide open for settlement. Peddlers, very prosaic, peripatetic figures, most of whom I can say we do not know their names, okay, and people who left us very little in the way of paper trails, which may help understand why very few historians have attempted to study them. These ordinary men were the juggernauts of the Jewish migration, and their experiences on the road made them the human engines whose quotidian, whose everyday actions drove the massive Jewish population shift, which brought millions of Jews out of Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed the Ottoman Empire, into a variety of new lands. Now, the peddling that I'm going to be talking about, this New World peddling, in some ways was hardly new to the Jews. At least since the Middle Ages, and encompassing every place where Jews had once lived, Jews engaged in retail trade, selling from packs on their backs, or, if a bit more affluent, from animal-driven carts. They sold in the Old World, in the pre-migration settings, they sold to Jews and to non-Jews. In the Old World, both Jewish women and Jewish men developed routes, relied on intra-Jewish economic connections, helped stimulate desire for new goods, and served as the fixtures of many local economies. In some regions and towns of the Jews' Old World, peddlers outnumbered non-peddlers in the Jewish community, and the clustering of Jews in this one occupation affected nearly all aspects of Jewish life. I don't think I would be going out on a limb to say that every Jew in Europe, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, would have known peddlers, would have known a or many peddlers, family members, neighbors, just the people who they knew in the ordinary course of life. One study of Polish Jews in the 19th century stated quite simply, quote, "A majority of the Jewish population of Poland made their lives living in trade, but this principally meant peddling rather than retail." The historian Jonathan Israel concluded about the 17th century, the great age of mercantilism, that all Jews were involved in, that all Jews involved in business were, quote, the most numerous of them were the masses of peddlers, hawkers, and old clothesmen who stood below craftsmen and artisans. Peddling clearly provided the overarching economic, political, social, cultural framework for the lives of many, if not most, of world Jewry before the late 18th century. But from the late 18th century on, it was peddling which pushed the Jews out to their many new worlds. The act of leaving an old familiar home through peddling was connected, these were connected to each other. Those Jews who went out to the New World to peddle may themselves have not peddled before. They were mostly young men, unable to find a place for themselves in the local economy in the regions where they grew up. Migration in some new setting offered them a way to establish themselves as adults and to get on with life. Okay, let me offer one family story, not my family personally, of how the experience of peddling and migration were linked and linked through family. So in the 1830s, a man from Bavaria, whose last name was Hammerslaw, and that's a familiar Springfield name, left Bavaria and settled in Baltimore. Within a year, he brought over a brother, and the two of them peddled. They each had their own route. And over the course of the next several years, they brought all of their brothers to Baltimore and then their sister. By the time they brought their sister to Baltimore, the brothers had done well enough that they had gone into the business of being peddler suppliers. So the Hammerslaw family clustered in Baltimore, peddling brought them. Peddling, supplying new peddlers was the business that they specialized in, and a name that will come up again in my talk was that one of the peddlers whom they supplied was a new immigrant also from Bavaria who came in the 1850s named Samuel Rosenwald. Okay, and it was Samuel Rosenwald who married Augusta Hammerslaw, and eventually this becomes very much a part of Springfield history. These young men, like the Hammerslaw brothers and Samuel Rosenwald, and millions like them, most of whose names have faded into obscurity, began a process of moving outward, discovering as Jews a number of new worlds, and peddling their old familiar economic modus operandi, structured their physical movement and their discovery of new worlds. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and just define who I mean by as a peddler. I'm referring here to somebody who sells retail goods directly to customers and who went door to door marketing his wares. He, and I'm not using the word, the male pronoun to be universal, I would never do that, but rather these were men who did this. They knocked on doors. They crossed the threshold of their customers' homes and sold house by house, farm by farm to the customers, nearly all of whom were women. Unlike the later traveling salesman, the Fuller Brush man who we may be familiar with, the peddler did not represent a corporation or a company. And while he did sell goods provided by a supplier, he could pick up and sell goods from more than one supplier. He could diversify. He wasn't really obliged to anyone so long as he paid back the merchant who had given him his goods. He developed his routes, he came up with his own system of record keeping, and he demonstrated tremendous flexibility in how and what he marketed. Just as one example of this, one peddler by the last name of Guggenheim sold, also from Bavaria, sold in the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania. And among the products he sold was some kind of stove polish, some kind of liquid to clean the insides of the stoves. And the women complained to him. They said every time they used this stove polish, their hands got very dirty, and they didn't like it. So he took the bottle of stove polish to somebody who knew something about chemistry and a pharmacist, and did analysis of what was the offending substance in that bottle of stove polish, and his friend concocted a batch of new kind of stove polish without the element in it, which was so unpleasant for the women. And he was able to go to each woman who had complained and said, I'm going to give you a free bottle of this. Okay, anytime I come, you can have a free bottle of this stove polish. So even though that the chemist who had concocted the stove polish wasn't his ordinary supplier, he had the flexibility to add new products when and where it seemed like it made good business sense. So they weren't the representatives of any company, but rather could be flexible in what they sold. I also distinguish between these on-the-road peddlers from urban peddlers, the operators, for example, of push carts in big cities. They certainly were important, and I think they deserve to be studied also, but they didn't go into their customers' homes. Rather, their customers came to them. So too, city streets were full of men, many of them immigrant Jews, who called out their goods from wagons, selling fruit and vegetables, or collecting old clothes. But these people also did not cross the thresholds of their customers' homes, but rather the customers ran out to meet them. So the peddlers whose experiences I'm sharing with you tonight did that. That is, they engaged in that really profound act of entering the homes of their customers, and in that lay a world of meaning and difference. So having defined them, let me move on and pose some questions that will be the organizing principles of this talk. So first, where did they come from? Okay, and where did they go? What did they sell, and to whom? How did they sell, and where did they get their goods? And how did their selling structure the lives of Jews in these many New World places? So first, in terms of where they left and what those places had in common. The peddlers who served as the vanguards of the New World, of New World Jewish migration left an enormous swath of land from Alsace in the west through the Ukraine in the east, with certain regions being particularly important, including Alsace and Bavaria, the former Polish province of Posen, which in 1871 would become part of Germany, Bohemia, which would end up as part of Czechoslovakia, and now the Czech Republic, and probably the single most important sender of peddlers to the New World was Lithuania. That corner of the northwestern Russian Empire, which sent out per capita the largest number and percentage of Jewish immigrants, and so many of the men took their first steps in their New World homes as peddlers. Jews also left various parts of the Ottoman Empire, those places which over time would be incorporated into countries that we now call Greece and Turkey, and I have in my notes here Yugoslavia, but obviously there is no such country there, so Serbia, Bosnia, and so on. So too Jewish men who came to the New World left Morocco and other parts of North Africa. This migration took place over the course of more than a century, and it moved from west to east, from north to south. In each one of those places, Jews faced increasing impoverishment as local economies changed, and the number of Jews competing for dwindling opportunities grew. Young people who were the hardest hit, and as they could neither make a living nor get married, for if they married, they'd have to support growing families, they had to go someplace else in order to sustain themselves. We cannot know what would have happened to them if migration opportunities had not opened up at precisely that moment in time, but they did. So where did they go? Well, about 4 million of them, again, over 1/3 of world Jewry, went to precisely those places which had opened up to European penetration due to colonial development and to the emergence of expansionist capitalism. These young men, and then the women and the children who would follow them, went to no less than the following places and regions: the United States, and I've already indicated that was the most important statistically, but they also went to Canada, Central and South America, places like Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, Peru, Chile, as well as to the Caribbean. They made their way to Southern Africa. Okay? They made their way to Australia and to New Zealand. All of these places we can call settler societies, lands with indigenous populations, which got pushed aside by European colonialism. The Jewish peddlers from all those places that I enumerated previously also went to places which we wouldn't really consider the New World in terms of the usual map of world history, but for the Jews, going to places like the British Isles, particularly Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, as well as parts of Scandinavia, constituted a new world for them because these were places that had had no Jews. In each one of these places and the many specific regions within them, peddlers as the first Jews, and in some cases the first white people, penetrated unknown spaces, or unknown to them. In various lands, the activities of the peddlers cleared the way for the eventual founding of settled Jewish communities, while in others, the peddlers and the Jewish presence disappeared, leaving few traces. The history of Jewish peddling in each new world has a history of its own. Each one is a story worth telling. I cannot tell them all, obviously, but one thing we can say is that nearly all the places they went were divided societies. Jews peddled to all the different language, religious, ethnic, and economic groups who lived there. In Quebec, for example, Jews peddled to English speakers, to French speakers, to the indigenous inhabitants. In Ireland, Jews sold to Catholics and to Protestants. In Australia, they spoke to English and Irish settlers as well as to the Aborigines. In Southern Africa, Jews found themselves crossing the threshold of British homes, of Afrikaner or Boer homes, as well as to the actual people who had lived in that region, that is the Africans. Each set of customers required a different strategy for selling, tailored to their tastes and sensibilities, and the peddlers had to be careful to not antagonize any or all of them. In one peddler memoir of a young man from Lithuania who went to Ireland, he told how his friend who got him set up in peddling told him that the most important thing he had to learn after he crossed the threshold of somebody's home was to figure out on the spot, were they Catholic or were they Protestant? Okay, well, why? Because if you go into a Catholic home, no matter what the woman might buy, you take out the rosaries, and you take out the religious statues and the religious paintings, so that they will know that you are in tune with who they are. He said, but if you go into a Protestant home and you pull out the rosaries and the plaster Virgin Marys and the Bleeding Heart of Jesus paintings, they'll throw you out and they won't buy anything else. So you have to learn who are your customers. So each constituency had a different reaction to the peddlers as Jews, as immigrants, as bearers of consumer goods. Young Jewish men who showed up in the American South peddled their wares in a particular racial landscape, one in which the black-white divide created a series of social practices not replicated in, let's say, New England or in upstate New York, where differences in class or religion rather than color structured political relationships. Further west, the presence of Native Americans and Mexicans as customers forced Jewish peddlers fresh from Posen or Lithuania or Rhodes to confront yet another set of on-the-ground realities where they sought to accomplish the goal of migration, which was to earn money, to earn enough of it to settle down, to marry, or to bring wives and children left behind, and to get on with life. So they sold to everyone and anyone, and as such picked up local knowledge so they could sell properly to each group of customers. The peddlers showed up wherever customers lived who had no access to the marketplace, that is the in-town store, and who wanted, or you might even say learned to want, certain kind of goods. The peddlers never sold food, they never sold fuel. Obviously, the two things we could define as absolute necessities. Rather, they filled their backs with buttons, needles, pins, ribbons, lace, fabrics, scissors, mirrors, watches, jewelry, eyeglasses, pictures and picture frames, cutlery, sheets, pillowcases, towels, and blankets, all goods associated with the home, bought by women, and all to some degree unnecessary. Okay, now when I read this in my research and I found eyeglasses, I thought, well, that seems to be necessary. But on the other hand, only necessary if you're living in a culture where you're reading all the time. So these are the kinds of goods that they brought into the women's homes. These were often goods that were new, and the peddlers taught them how to use these items, taught them why these items would enhance their lives. They sold wherever they went, in that whole large new world to which they went. They sold to farm families, and they sold to families who lived on the outskirts of cities. They sold in mining camps and in logging camps. They went to steel mill towns and textile mill towns. They sold on plantations, either those worked by slave labor or by free labor. They sold on Indian reservations. They sold wherever there were customers who might want what they had. And in each one of these places, these immigrant Jewish men sold to women. Wherever they immigrated to and peddled, regardless of country or continent, unlike old world peddling, the Jewish immigrants sold to only non-Jews. Since the peddlers, by and large, penetrated minimally settled regions, they had no opportunity to sell to other Jews. Okay, we'll see that this point had some pretty important historical significance, not just for the peddlers themselves, but for the development of Jewish communities in these places. The young man who decided to leave Alsace or Lithuania and try his luck in the Mississippi Delta, the Pacific Northwest, the Transvaal, the Australian Outback, the Argentine Pampas, the Irish Midlands, the mining regions of Wales, or the foothills of the Andes, had no Jewish community to go to at the end of the day, okay? Had no local Jews living in small towns who would put them up. On a daily basis, they could not depend upon local Jews and Jewish communities to extend their homes or their communal resources to them as places of refuge for the itinerant peddler, as had been the case in Europe. And it's one of the ways in which peddling in the New World was different than Old World peddling. Since the peddlers divided up the countryside among themselves, that is, each peddler had his own route, and it was always called his Medina, his kingdom, or his state, no one encroaching upon another's territory, they lived pretty much devoid of contact with other Jews, okay, at least during the week. This reality reflected the fact that the first of the peddlers went to places where no Jews had lived before. In sporadic and scattered documents written by peddlers about the conditions of their lives, they tell of the sense of absolute loneliness and drudgery, of harsh conditions, of snarling dogs chasing after them, of rowdy young boys throwing snowballs at them. So Abraham Cohn, who came to from Bavaria to the United States in the 1840s, and whose name, by the way, appears on that wheel of associates of Abraham Lincoln, okay, and I'll say one more thing about him in a second. He went so far to write in his diary, one of our best statements about a peddler, in his diary to rhetorically address, quote, the youth of Bavaria. Beware, for you shall rue the hour you embarked for a country and a life far different from what you dreamed of. This land, and particularly this calling, peddling, offers harsh, cold air, great masses of snow, and people who are credulous, filled with silly pride, cold towards foreigners, towards all who do not speak their language perfectly. So Abraham Cohn, as I said, his name appears on the wheel in the exhibit. The other place you'll see him in there is there's a facsimile of a flag that has Hebrew lettering on it. And he was the Chicago merchant who was friendly with Lincoln and who sewed, because he was also a tailor, he sewed on that flag a verse from the book of Joshua and gave it to Lincoln as he left from Illinois to go to the White House. So one thing, you get a little bit of a hint of what I'm going to say later, which is for most of these peddlers, peddling was just a brief stage, and for most, they most experienced some modicum of success in their new homes. So peddling it was a miserable experience, he wrote. They were robbed. In fact, they were robbed a lot. Okay, some of them were murdered. Okay, they were easy prey for ruffians up to no good who saw that these were men who went each by himself out on the road unarmed with cash and goods. Yet such stories, which were told all over the world through the Jewish press and by word of mouth, did not deter young men from venturing out to the New World and to assuming rightly that peddling would give them a start. New World Jewish peddling, unlike Old World Jewish peddling, New World Jewish peddlers, unlike their counterparts in the Old World, did not travel as far, and they organized their selling lives in such a way that they could get back to whatever constituted the closest hub of Jewish life for the Sabbath. The life histories of many of these immigrant peddlers repeatedly noted that their lives marched along a weekly rhythm. They set out for their routes on Sunday or Monday, depending on how far the starting point of their route was from this hub, from the town, but they returned by Friday to whatever existed in the way of a Jewish community, for food, for fellowship, for rest, and probably for prayers also. And we'll also see it was also part of their business. Joseph Jacob, in a 1919 book called The Jewish Contribution to Civilization, described how in England, which, as I said, in terms of Jewish migration history, we should think of as a New World destination, quote, "It was customary for the Jews of the seaport towns to set out every morning to neighboring villages as hawkers," it's the British word for peddling, "who would return in time for the Friday night meal." Jacobs tells us that the peddlers in England, or the hawkers in England, called themselves Wachers, okay, Wach being the German or Yiddish word for a week, or weekly people. Indeed, in Ireland, to which several thousand Lithuanian Jews immigrated after the 1880s, and where nearly every man at one time or another peddled, they were actually called the weekly man. So women would say, well, the weekly man's coming today. Okay, rather than calling him the peddler. And these were the ones who showed up week after week at the farmhouses, ready to collect payment for what had previously been purchased, since they sold on the installment plan, and to show the woman of the house something new to buy. In some Spanish-speaking countries, the peddlers, whether they were Polacos, which was the word for the Polish Jewish peddlers, or Turcos, who were the peddlers from the Ottoman Empire, were all called Semananiks, semana being the Spanish word for a week. So whether it was England or Ireland or Cuba, or indeed Australia or South Africa or Illinois or Ohio, the peddlers repaired on Friday to the nearest hub of Jewish life. This pattern laid the groundwork for the creation of Jewish communities. Jewish shopkeepers in the towns and the cities maintained personal connections to the peddlers. Okay, in the story of the Hammerslaws, Samuel Rosenwald peddled out of Baltimore into Virginia, and every Friday he came back to Baltimore and lodged with the Hammerslaws. Okay, he met his wife there, okay, since he was going to marry one of the sisters, the sister. So the Jewish shopkeepers in the towns and the cities maintained intense relationships with the peddlers, often kin or relatives, but not necessarily. These were the people who supplied them with goods. They gave them their Medina, or their route, and helped them learn the rudiments of the language: English, Spanish, Swedish, Irish, French, Mayan, Cherokee, okay, or so many other and often multiple languages. These nodes of Jewish life, scattered through the hinterlands where the peddlers spent their weekends and holidays, reflected the dense Jewish underpinnings of peddling and of settlements. Again, another name that shows up on the wheel, a man by the name of Simon Wolf. He himself never peddled, but his uncle, with whom he lived in Ulrichsville, Ohio, was a former peddler, now shopkeeper. And Wolf, in his autobiography, talks about how every Friday a couple dozen peddlers, all of whom were the creditors of his uncle, showed up, and how his aunt cooked for all of these men and gave them at least one good meal. And I will return to food shortly. So the outlines of congregations began to take shape in these small towns, and again, often in larger cities as well. And the communities were made up of the former peddlers, who become small-town merchants, or the owners of peddler warehouses, the owners of dry goods stores, sometimes the owners of junkyards, and the like. The reality that Jewish peddlers spent most of their time while peddling with non-Jews, that is, their customers, 5 days out of 7, they were with their customers, forced them into a quick encounter with difference and put them nearly immediately on the path towards learning new languages, new cultures, and new social realities. Language, indeed, provides one of the key issues which both the peddlers had to confront, and which I think makes their history very noteworthy in terms of studying the modern Jewish experience. Peddlers had to proceed immediately with the task of learning the dominant language or languages which their customers spoke. Unlike those Jews who remained in the big cities, New York, London, Leeds, Toronto, Montreal, Buenos Aires, and functioned in thick Jewish communities where they, for the most part, worked with other Jews, lived among other Jews, the peddlers had to learn the local languages at whatever their customers spoke. Okay, initially other Jews, usually again their creditors, themselves former peddlers, helped them out with the rudiments of the language, writing out on a sheet of paper, a kind of crib sheet that we might have used in high school when we were trying to cheat on an exam. They would write out in Hebrew or Yiddish or Ladino or Arabic, since again they're North African Jews migrating, write out in again those characters, "Good morning, ma'am." How are you? Okay, or buenos dias, señora. Okay, como está? So that is, they'd write out the key words and phrases that the incipient peddler needed to know, since the newcomers could not delay the process of becoming familiar with the languages with which they needed to make their sales. They also had to sleep in their customers' homes at the end of the workday. Okay, certainly something they found preferable to sleeping in a field or an empty lot or on the back of their wagon when they had graduated from walking the road to riding behind a on a horse-drawn vehicle. Time spent in their customers' homes became time to acculturate in the new society, to meet and to interact with people so different than themselves. For one, these peddlers became teachers of Judaism to the men and women who had never previously met a Jew. I'm going to offer two very brief examples of this, one from somebody very famous and one not. So the very famous one is the great British poet William Blake. And if you're familiar with Blake, you know he has Hebrew writing in many of his drawings and his lithographs. And he talked about meeting a Jewish peddler who came to his home to sell, and he asked the peddler to teach him the Hebrew alphabet so he could weave these into his art. Okay. Another much less well-known person than William Blake was a woman named J. Ida Jiggets, who became a dietitian. And she, by the 1940s, wrote a book. She'd become fascinated with Jews, and she wrote a book called Jewish Diet and Culture. And she begins the book by saying, you know, people ask me, how did I, a Negro woman, become interested in Jewish culture? She said the most wonderful day in her small town in Georgia was the day of the week when the Jewish peddler came. And he would come into her house and would explain all the places in the world where the goods had come from. And she said the peddler made a deal with her father that in exchange for buying some item, the peddler would teach her father a Hebrew word. Many of the peddlers in memoirs and other writings remarked on how, particularly in the American Midwest and the American South, as well as in South Africa, as they were spending the night in their customers' homes, they were invited to read the Bible with the family, awed as those customers were that now they had in their home one of the, quote, chosen people. The customers saw these Jews donning their prayer shawls and putting on their, to fill in their phylacteries in the morning to do their morning prayers, and naturally asked, what are you doing? And it became the peddler's job, as it were, to explain Jewish customs. Sleeping over in the customers' homes was an important moment of interreligious, intercultural communication and exchange. Okay, perhaps equally important and equally potentially equally fraught was the issue of food. That is, when the peddlers slept in the customers' homes, the housewife, who was probably very happy having just bought a tablecloth or curtains or some piece of crockery, would offer the peddler, well, will you eat with us? Well, wherever they went and they lived in these situations and experienced these situations, the peddlers had to, some peddlers, but some of them were in their memoirs and in their writings, said, I'll eat anything. I don't care what it is. And others, including Abraham Cohn, again, the man who knew Lincoln, said when he was on the road, he ate whatever was offered, but once he settled down in Chicago and his mother emigrated to join him, his mother had come from Bavaria a few years after Cohn settled in Chicago, one of his first acts as a leader of the Chicago Jewish community was to find somebody who could provide kosher meat. So the eating of the customer's food was something he had to do and did it while he was on the road. Others, again, were probably very happy to get a taste of bacon or pork. And others, however, said, I cannot eat your food. Which led for the housewife to immediately ask, well, why can't you eat it? My religion doesn't allow it, and while this could be a culturally very uncomfortable, potentially conflicted situation, in every memoir that we have, every document from either the point of view of the peddler or the customer, the reaction was, well, tell me what you can eat and I'll make it for you. I can eat fruit, I can eat vegetables. Sometimes the peddler would leave a pot in the home of each one of his, each one of the homes in which he was going to sleep so he could cook his own food. Okay, a famous story which cannot be verified, but I'm going to hope it's true since I quote it in the book, involves the Cherokee Indians who used to refer to the peddlers as egg eaters because the one thing they would eat were eggs cooked in their shells. Wherever these men went and they lived in these in-between situations, they lived as between people who functioned at the margins of the world into which they entered on a weekly basis. They had no choice but to develop relationships with the people to whom they sold and to whom they wanted to sell even more. By definition, they had to learn their potential customers' tastes and ingratiate themselves with the women who opened the doors, looked in the baskets, made the decisions whether to buy the eyeglasses, picture frames, curtains, blankets, and other sundry goods. A memoir written by a woman who grew up in Oregon in the 1850s described the interactions of the women of Pass Creek Canyon with a peddler named Aaron Meyer. The women, now these are people who are really isolated in the 1850s, and they suffered from the lack of needles to doing their sewing, and they had no access to a store to buy some in order to, for example, darn socks. But then, quote, one day about Thanksgiving time, a peddler with a mule came over the pass and down the canyon. We children were playing on some logs, saw him, and ran to tell our mother that a visitor was coming. Okay. When the women started talking with him, they barraged him, do you have needles? Because that was the thing they really needed. And again, back to the memoir of this little girl who obviously wrote it when she grew up, he, quote, reached into his inside pocket and said to them, my people do not celebrate Christmas, but I suppose you good people will soon be having a holiday with presents. Okay, Meyer then reached into his pocket. He removed, quote, a thin package. And from inside the package, Meyer took out some darning needles. All I have, but I believe they will be enough for every family in the canyon to have one. And he gave these as Christmas gifts to the women who, needless to say, remained his loyal customers for as long as he was on the road. For the Jewish Meyer to be conscious of the flow of the Christian calendar and the tradition that his customers meant that he could cultivate goodwill and good business. They had to acquire local social and knowledge of local social and political relationships to figure out who and where the most likely customers lived, what topics to avoid, what aspirations to play upon. Now, the peddlers had a kind of sort of schedule, one might say. It was different for each one of them, but basically they started out on foot. Okay, they were often known as foot peddlers. One commentator, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, claimed that the average peddler carried over 100 pounds on his back. Okay, and this was walking from morning until night with this heavy load. His first purchase was a wagon. Okay, or sometimes he would rent a wagon and a horse and be able to cover a larger distance and to carry heavier goods, sewing machines, stoves, and the like. Notably, wherever the peddlers lived, and again, it was a global phenomenon, once they had a wagon, they diversified their activities, and they were not only selling goods, but they also were acquiring things. Okay, and I put things in kind of quotes: feathers, scraps of metal, old rags, old bones, herbs, pieces of paper. Much of this was scavenged so that they didn't necessarily have to pay for it. They often enlisted their female customers to gather herbs for them. Okay, so the peddler would acquire all this, fill up his wagon, he'd get back to town with a full wagon rather than an empty one, and sell all of these acquired junk to Jewish junk dealers, okay, and to Jewish manufacturers, and to Jewish businesses who could use and resell. Jewish tailors had a big business in taking rags and reselling it into clothes. So the peddlers, as such, became more than just sellers of goods, but also perhaps our first recyclers. Now, they went into regions and they left them. They were here in a town on Monday and gone, and by Tuesday in another town, and gone from that town on Tuesday and then in another one. They seemingly had no permanent abode. They seemed to be utterly unfixed in terms of where they belonged. Very difficult, by the way, for historians, because therefore they don't show up in the census. Okay, and they don't show up as peddlers, but they also, that's obviously not their problem that they weren't in the census, but they did certainly stimulate suspicion. Who are these people? Where are they from? Why are they here today and gone tomorrow? This suspicion was usually dormant, it was below the surface, but at times or moments of crisis, it sparked into tremendous fear. And again, I'm going to reference the exhibit that grants Order Number 11, which was to expel the Jews from the area of Kentucky and under the jurisdiction of the Union Army, was because of these peddlers, these Jewish traders who seemed to float in and float out. Okay, they were not supposed to be there, and yet they'd keep showing up. So in one place around the world, just as in the case with General Grant, in one place after another around the peddler's globe, the entry of Jewish itinerant merchants into the rural regions unsettled locally prevailing economic relations. They were able to sell differently and one might say better than local merchants. For one thing, the women they came to the women did not have to travel into town. But more than that, they upended previously rigid relationships. So the Jewish peddler in the rural South may have been the only individual to enter the homes of white people and African Americans with the same goal in mind: to sell goods to somebody willing to pay. So too, Jewish peddlers who made their way around the Cape Colony made no distinction between the homes of English farmers and those of the Boers. So in a way, they didn't see group, they just saw customers. This disruptive role played by the peddlers stemmed in part from the fact that as outsiders, they could sometimes transgress conventional boundaries of etiquette. They could claim they didn't know the local rules as they sold goods to customers regardless of skin tone, religion, language, or nationality. that Jewish peddlers in the late 19th, early 20th century in southern communities lodged at times in the homes of African Americans, ate at their tables, and developed what for that time and place constituted a respectful public relationship, offered a case in point. A former peddler by the name of Morris Witkowski, who produced one of the best peddler life histories, asserted that he and his, quote, brother peddlers were probably the first white people in the South who paid the Negro people any respect at all. And he claimed that he and the others, when they addressed their black customers, called them Mr. or Mrs., an unheard of piece of etiquette or manners that a white person would never have called a black person Mr. or Mrs. Peddlers could break the rules because local people on farms, in mining camps, and on the fringes of cities not connected to downtown shopping districts reveled in the items the peddlers had for sale. The peddlers offered new goods, new standards of consumption, and cosmopolitan styles at low rates of credit, but they also invoked the anger of the settled shopkeepers whom the peddlers could undersell. And the shopkeeper had a store, he had to pay rent, or he had to pay taxes. He had much overhead expense that the peddler didn't have. He just had it on his back. Okay, local shopkeepers and farm women, local shopkeepers demanded that the farm women and that the women buy from them. They said, we're your own kind, you should buy from us. These women who had only limited dollars or pounds or pesos, whatever the currency for purchasing stuff, then in a way were put in a position of power as they chose between the Jewish peddler and their compatriots, the store owners, often relatives, friends, people certainly with whom they shared many characteristics. As one example of this, Jewish immigrant peddlers developed peddling routes in the various mining regions of the world, the coal fields of West Virginia and of Australia, the Mesabi Iron Range of Minnesota, the copper country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, just to name a few. And in all of these places, the mine owners operated company stores, making sure that they could basically gain back all the wages they had paid the miners by their purchases. The miners and their wives preferred to shop from the peddlers who came to their homes, and this infuriated the mine owners. They tried all sorts of strategies to ban the peddlers from competing with them, setting off political and economic struggles. The peddlers and the shopkeepers, in essence, courted these relatively poor women who, as such, gained some power through their purchasing choices. The merchants of the place argued directly or indirectly that group loyalty demanded that the women buy from them. They pointed out that the peddler combined in one physical being foreignness, religious otherness, and an economic challenge to the local order. Yet the peddler offered new goods, credit, and direct access to the merchandise, coming directly into the woman's home, showing her how the curtains would look on her window and how the pictures would be when they graced her parlor, would look, how that would look, drew the women more intimately into the fantasies of consumption. At times, the competition which pitted Jewish peddlers against non-Jewish merchants led directly to anti-Jewish agitation and even violence. Probably the most dramatic example took place in Ireland in the first decade of the 20th century in the city of Limerick, where a Redemptorist priest, very much allied with the nationalists and with the local shopkeepers, demanded that the women not buy from the peddlers, and he pronounced what ended up being a 2-year boycott of Jewish peddlers. He preached against the Jewish peddlers. He indeed had priests who worked for him follow the peddlers as the peddler made his route, and went to each woman's home and said, don't buy from him, don't buy from him, don't pay him back the money he owes you, he's a parasite, he's a Christ killer. And what is really quite remarkable is that the women stuck with the peddlers. And in one of the cases that got reported in the local Limerick newspaper, the woman had just bought a blanket from the peddler, and she was holding on to one end of it, and the priest was trying to yank it out of her hand, and she pulled it, and she said to the priest, "Get off my land. I've been buying from this weekly man for several years, and he's never been anything but fair and polite to me." So this kind of agitation took place with some frequency around the world. The presence of Jewish peddlers at times and in various places played itself out in local and national politics as the merchants, through their representatives, sought to limit the access of peddlers, who they often referred to as foreigners, sometimes as Jews, to the privileges of the marketplace. The state of North Carolina, for example, passed a law requiring peddlers to show proof of citizenship before getting a license to peddle. Okay, obviously, the peddlers were not citizens. By the time they qualified for citizenship, they weren't peddling any longer. So this was one of the multiple ways in which the presence of foreign peddlers, Jews primarily, became politicized. The halls of city and county councils, courthouses, state legislatures, and even national assemblies became places for the debates over the merits and demerits of Jewish peddling. Just let me give one example. There was an inquest in the Cape Colony, that is what would eventually become part of South Africa, over the Jewish peddlers. One representative did get up and say, "As far as I'm concerned, the Jewish peddlers should all be expelled, but our wives and daughters will never put up with that." So let me use that as a way to bring this into a conclusion. Despite the agitation and the laws which made it difficult for the Jewish peddlers persevered in their routes, returning time and again to these locales to cultivate customers, and they abandoned their routes only when better opportunities beckoned elsewhere or when they could open a store and get off the road. When they gave up their peddling and settled down, particularly in towns which had been part of their regions, they became respected members of the community. Samuel Rosenwald offers us a very wonderful example of that, winning enough trust of the local non-Jewish populace. Many of them went on to hold office. Again, another name that shows up on the wall is a man by the name of Marcus Spiegel, a Bavarian Jewish immigrant who peddled in Ohio, and was eventually appointed as the postmaster of the town. Okay, the Jewish men who had migrated to peddle and peddled in order to migrate did so for a brief duration. Rather than being a life sentence, they only did it for a brief period of time. They didn't continue in it for decades, and nor, perhaps more importantly, did sons pick up their father's packs or sit down behind their father's horses. Some of them did incredibly well. Okay, I've already mentioned the name Rosenwald, and it was Julius, the son of Samuel Rosenwald, who, I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb, may say be made the most famous person to ever be born in Springfield. So there's one tremendous success story. But even some of the former peddlers have names you know, like Lehman and Guggenheim and Gimbel and Strauss, both the Strauss whose name is on the back of your blue jeans, okay, as well as the Strauss of Macy's. Now, most of them didn't become Lehmans or Guggenheims, but did in fact achieve exactly what impelled their migration. They went from unskilled but eager to learn peddler to respectable shopkeeper, and this was a social reality. For most, which doesn't mean that there weren't failures, that there weren't disappointments. For most of them, the migration had been worth it. They spent their time on the road. They earned enough to get married or send for wives and children. They went into settled businesses, which allowed them to get off the road, to become members of local Jewish communities and citizens of their new lands. Their story, I think, speaks very much to this place being Illinois and Springfield, and indeed the Lincoln Museum. I've alluded to some of the names of former peddlers, which are festooned over the texts of the exhibit. But more than that, it was peddlers, Jewish peddlers, who were the first Jews to come to this region. And it was these Jewish peddlers were the first Jews who the town dwellers would ever know, sometimes maybe even the only ones. And despite their obscurity and anonymity, they brought goods to people in remote places, made it possible for Jewish life to take place in this and many other new worlds. Thank you.